This is a piece of research that was funded by the European Commission, and it was DG Employment, Social Affairs and Inclusion who actually funded the research. It was commissioned at a time when the DG was particularly interested in finding out about lifelong guidance policies and practices as part of validation of learning procedures and social inclusion and exclusion. That's great, thank you. So I'll continue. I don't quite know why. Anyway, so, and as you can see from that first OHT, we did it as a consortia with the University of Jyväskylä. And I know that many of you, thank you, that's brilliant. Many of you will know both Jana and Remo and know of their work. So 3 of us from Warwick worked with Jana and Remo during the course of about 15 months when we were doing this piece of research. Right, so, no, I can't. So can we go on to the next one, Sarah? What I want to do during the time that I've got is introduce the study and then provide an overview of selected findings. And then talk to you about some innovations in practice that we came across and quickly go through conclusions and recommendations that we made to the EU. And what I'd like to do is talk for about 45 minutes. It is kind of content heavy because it's a very full report. And I want to just give you an overview and give you a taste. But once I finish speaking, what I'd like to invite you to do is go into some breakout discussion groups. And the 2 questions that I'd like you to perhaps consider is, first of all, because you're all students in research methodology in our field, is think about the methodology that was used as a piece of funded research with 5 sort of experienced researchers, and think about how that might be different from unfunded research. And then the second question that I'd like you to think about in discussion groups is just literally to pick out the finding that you found most interesting or surprising or perhaps controversial. Okay, so that's the structure that I'll follow in the timeline. So the scope of the study was to gather, analyse and synthesise evidence on lifelong guidance, policy and initiatives across the, as it was then, regrettably 28 European countries, focusing on the systems and structures that existed. The EU also wanted us to look at recent advancements in lifelong guidance practices, identify elements of effective practice, and then explore the potential future of our field, highlighting areas for further development and coordination. So the research questions that framed the investigation are up there on the screen. How should career guidance evolve to support transitions between learning and work and to support lifelong learning across the life course? And what areas of career guidance policy and delivery would benefit from greater cooperation or action at EU level? So the approach to the study, because of the scope and the specified research questions, ended up as being a mixed method study comprising a fairly comprehensive literature review of both academic and grey literature. The 5 of us involved in the research conducted 30 in-depth interviews, and we conducted 2 expert workshops to explore current practice and review findings. So the numbers from our field contributing to the study was 72 across 23 of the 28 EU member states, with some of the people contributing representing EU level organisations. They all had some form of expertise to offer, but the list of experts was approved by the Commission. The key areas of analysis were the profile and type of activities and actors involved in lifelong guidance in the EU. As I've already hinted at, new and emerging guidance practices, tools and innovations, key principles of services, and feedback and suggestions on lifelong guidance activities that require greater coordination and cooperation. So the context of the research, remember, the EU commissioned this, and the context related very much to the European Pillar of Social Rights, looking at the need to increase employment opportunities for job seekers, the whole debate around the future of work, identifying the need to encourage participation in lifelong learning across the life course, this sort of knotty problem of validation of non-formal and informal learning as part of the new skills agenda, kind of the fourth policy strand, if you like, relevant, was the upskilling pathways, new opportunities for adults, which complemented the youth guarantee, the work that had been done on young people. It was taking forward the main conclusions from the Estonian EU presidency in 2017, which was recommending establishment and maintaining lifelong guidance provision and universal access. And then finally, going forward, the European Green Deal, with the need to create new industries and therefore new jobs. So that was the background to the research, if you like, before we started. And then the background for the findings and implementation, of course, is COVID. And what we are now living through is an era that was unimagined and unimaginable. And as a community of practice, using Ree's concept, this is an area where we are all, I think, struggling to find our pathway through it, but hopeful and optimistic about the opportunities this presents for our field. Okay, so next. I think there have been, and there were when we started the investigation, there are now global shifts in guidance provision that are discernible. One of them, quite obviously, is away from intervention at key points in an individual's life to a more lifelong perspective. And I think Ree's presentation that we have just listened to is a very powerful illustration of that type of shift. And another shift that's evident is from the provision of external expert support to sort of empowering the individual to develop and utilize career management skills and other complementary skills. So two big shifts, I think, that are evident to us all in the field. I'm not going to dwell on the definitional issues that exist in our field around what it is we're doing and how do we define the activities of career guidance and lifelong learning. The one definition that we took and worked with as part of the research was from the Council of the European Union, and the notion that lifelong guidance is a continuous process that enables citizens at any age and at any point in their lives to identify their capacities, competencies, and interests, to make educational, train, and occupational decisions, and to manage their individual life paths in learning, work, and other settings in which those capacities and competencies are learned. Guidance covers a range of individual and collective activities, sort of, et cetera, et cetera. So that's the definition that we used to frame the approach that we took. Thanks, Sarah. So again, in a sense, before we started talking to experts, there were a number of issues that were fairly clear when it comes to thinking about comprehensive lifelong guidance systems. One is that it's a very complex picture because of the divisions between contexts and the uncertainties that continue in how to deal with issues of professionalisation and support in education, training and employment. And as our research progressed, this became more and more evident. I think emerging from that complexity is or are the difficulties in aligning with the practices of others within the field, and perhaps an overriding influencing factor or factors are the way that the structure and culture of institutions often constrain practice. So if you like, the analytical framework that we use to investigate lifelong guidance systems across the whole of the EU was derived from the literature. So we didn't come up with these categories, but we took them from existing sort of research and publications. And we used those 11 features to frame how we were exploring and examining the systems in each of the 28 EU countries. And what I'm going to do now is work through each of those to give you the highlights of our findings. And we represented each feature according to 4 dimensions. But we put in a sense, a health warning there. Please note that these don't represent rankings or even a continuum, but rather snapshots in time to illustrate and describe how particular dimension features as part of a lifelong guidance system. And you'll appreciate that now we're into a kind of sensitive arena where we're trying to typify systems of lifelong guidance systems in different countries. We had a steering group from the European Union. I lost count of how many were on the steering group, but there were a number of people on the steering group, and a number of people were reading drafts of the report as we were going along. So we were very careful not to imply any form of evaluative criteria that was being used. So if you could just bear that in mind as we work through the different dimensions. So the first of the 11 dimensions, characteristics, features that we were using was lifelong guidance legislation. And I think fairly self-evidently, this provides the basis for the development of any system and can also be a tool to clarify jurisdictional responsibilities. So what it can do is specify entitlements to services, the way these services are delivered, and the strategies that might be implemented in a particular country context to target particular disadvantaged groups. And for this particular feature, we identified 4 dimensions: non-existent, notional, embedded in other policies, or explicit. So the current picture across the EU is summarised in that box, and hopefully this starts to give you an indication of the complexity of the findings when we were trying to represent this in relation to the EU member states. So the countries where it was evident that there was lifelong guidance legislation, some recently updated or being reviewed, are in the top position. And then as we work through legislation setting out citizens' entitlement to career guidance, lifelong guidance embedded in legislation on education or employment, and then legally defined qualifications of career practitioners. I should have said right at the beginning that the link to the report that has been published by DG Employment is in your resources, so you can delve into each of these findings, if you like, in more detail if you are interested in that particular dimension. So just to give you a flavour, and I'll be doing this for each of the features, of what was meant by the dimensions identified. So in relation to legislation, there are some countries where it's non-existent. There's been a deregulation of career guidance. The second column there is notional, where career guidance may be included in the legislation, but there's no follow-up on implementation. And it tends to be perceived as an external function in sector-specific legislation. The third column there is where legislation is embedded in other policies, like education, vocational education, training, and/or employment, and there's some examples right at the bottom of where that was found. And then the final column, explicit, organisations have legal responsibilities to provide career guidance. Okay, so hopefully that gives you a flavour of the way in which we progressed the analysis of data. And the second feature was strategic leadership, where that refers to how policy and lifelong guidance systems are managed at different levels: national, regional, and local, where coordination and I should say cooperation mechanisms that implicate relevant stakeholders in policy and systems development, with a focus on policy and administrative responsibility. And the 4 dimensions there, again, non-existent, multi-level, managerial, hierarchical, or where there was a shared vision and strategy. So again, in summary, the non-existent column relates to countries whereby basic guidance services are based on projects, typically, without national leadership. And national priorities depend strongly on parliamentary elections, which, as you know, change. Second column, multi-level. National guidance or other normative documents are in place. Usually there is local implementation. The third column refers to countries where there is a managerial and hierarchical system of strategic leadership, with different government sectors monitoring the implementation of career services within their own sectors. There's some examples of countries right at the bottom. And finally, the shared vision and strategy, where career guidance is integrated in national skills strategies, where there's establishment of national coordination entities or research units to follow up the implementation of strategies. And the national strategy is based on indicators. The scope of provision in different guidance contexts refers to where lifelong guidance provision and services are situated, we found from the research. Services are established in some sectors and not others. And the provision of services operate in silos or cross-sectoral with greater coordination and cooperation. And the 4 dimensions evident in relation to this scope of provision was fragile, fragmented, separate but linked, or cross-sectoral. So to say a little bit more about each of those dimensions, where the scope of provision is fragile, it is very limited across contexts and tends to be found in countries which make extensive use of temporary, particularly project funding. The second column, fragmented, where provision is very strong in some contexts, but often takes place in silos. A fourth column, some separated, some linked, where provision linked with educational provision, but not all guidance contexts are linked. And the fourth column, cross-sectoral, where there's a mandate linking guidance provision to lifelong learning on a cross-sectoral basis. So the sector strategies with lifelong guidance integrated, some countries have attempted at the strategic level to integrate guidance with other sector strategies. And there are some examples of those. Okay, the fourth feature, and I think as I work my way through these features, it becomes apparent just how complex our field is, and how difficult it is to make sense of the complexities and work towards cohesion and coherence. But nevertheless, I think evidence-based research like this gives us some starting points. So the fourth feature relates to lifelong guidance and lifelong learning strategies and policies. And what this particular feature does is highlight the role of lifelong guidance in supporting individuals, not only in the education sector, but in employment and beyond the education sector. It recognises that individuals, perhaps more now than ever before, need to reskill and upskill to stay part of the labour market. And it looks at the relationship between guidance and learning within some kind of overarching framework. So again, the dimensions, and it probably starts having a familiar feel to it. At one end, we have the fragile, temporary or minimal, working through to partial and separate to overarching, coherent. Okay. So under the fragile and temporary minimal, there may be links in early stages of development, or else exert minimal influence on practice. And then we could move to those countries where there may be a linked strategy in place, but then practice is constrained by weaknesses in either or both components. A third column, a third set of possibilities is where lifelong guidance and learning strategies operate within their own domains, but with very little interaction. And then finally, lifelong guidance and lifelong learning strategies are integrated and refer to each other. So moving on to the fifth feature, which is coordination and cooperation. And this particular area of research investigation focused on the mechanisms that support communication, service delivery, and knowledge sharing between the various stakeholders in lifelong guidance systems at different levels across local, regional, and national dimensions. So there are clearly examples of mechanisms that strive to do this around knowledge sharing and national fora. And the four dimensions identified within this area was insular, bilateral, multilateral, and open. So moving on, I think it's the question that's posed at the top of that slide. What level should cooperation and coordination occur to secure maximum impact? And the three levels that are very evident from the research. One relates to a national level, where all stakeholder agencies and relevant ministries need to be linked to enable best possible coordination. At regional and local level, municipalities and local public employment service offices are increasingly important in coordinating lifelong guidance stakeholders. At the European level, sustained EU policy debate on lifelong guidance is considered by many experts to be a key reference for national work on guidance. And then at an international level, I think it became evident that professional associations play an absolutely key and pivotal role in representing our field internationally. Okay, so the different dimensions. One, insular, where there's minimal communication. Secondly, the bilateral, which was typified by stakeholder groups convened for different purposes, but with a very specific brief relating typically to a particular sector. And again, perhaps with policy or funding support. Thirdly, multilateral, where interventions are undertaken that may be successful and influential in the short term, but not sustainable because the funding is short term. And then finally, sustainable mechanisms with links amongst services and professionals, employers, and regional organisations. The sixth feature that we had a look at was the delivery mechanisms for guidance. And I think this very much relates to many of the things that Ree was talking about. And currently, when we look at delivery of guidance across the European Union, it's quite obvious that there is a whole range of delivery models in practice. Often differentiated delivery with a focus on the specific needs of individuals. We have an increasing shift towards widening access for all citizens, with self-access and self-help an increasing characteristic. And finally, collaborative delivery based on special services for a more holistic approach. And indeed, the dimensions as indicated below are minimal, fragmented, integrated and coordinated. Right, so minimally, where services are targeted at particular groups. Fragmented, a range of services and stakeholders are available but not coordinated. Integrated and coordinated, free and open access to services where clients can access services from a range of providers who are working in partnership. And holistic, a coherent system where multi-channeled services intersect across the range of institutions, delivering guidance-related support based on an holistic approach. So the sort of question that we asked ourselves when we were looking at this particular aspect of the research is, what would an ideal delivery model look like? And it would look like something that was based on a holistic system where it's delivered through the live course, starting with career guidance being embedded within school curricula as early as possible, individualized and differentiated, where technology is integrated into all aspects, and where collaborative and or coordinated guidance delivery is through a range of partners, ensuring services are personalized and relevant to the individual. It's a kind of ideal scenario for which we can only hope and work towards. Okay, so now we're on labour market information, and this is becoming increasingly a matter for policy concern, and it refers to the collection, dissemination of labour market information that may be undertaken for a range of purposes, not always linked to lifelong guidance. It relates to data used to support education planning and policy, increasingly supported by technology and open data. And there's a trend for the establishment of national online single points of access. So inaccessible, you have the scenarios in some countries where data are collected by different stakeholders but not generally accessible. Secondly, where research is undertaken and data are publicly available but may be inconsistent and unreliable. Third scenario is where there are systematic processes in place to collect and disseminate labour market information that are publicly available. Systems are coordinated and support policy formation and also contribute to service and education planning. And then the final possibility is where it is systematic and coordinated for the collection and dissemination of official and impartial data that are updated in real time and mediated by professionals. And we have some examples of that, which is truly astonishing. So that summarizes the different countries and where they sit in relation to those different stages of development, if you like. So if we move on to ICT strategy, and I think it's not possible to ignore the importance of technology in our field, and in our current situation it is particularly obvious. So the role of ICT, it has been long argued by many that it's important and increasingly essential in our field, although it is controversial. It is not without its controversy. And it's about an agreement between and amongst relevant parties to enable a systematic use of technology. There has been considerable progress in integrating technology, but we have a way to go. And I think it is evident when you look at the research that successful integration depends on policy support at both macro and micro levels. Critical and often neglected is workforce development, and an ICT system that fits the specific purpose. So ways in which ICT is being used and integrated in our field are typified in the dimension, where it is predominantly used to publish information. Secondly, widening access to guidance and information through more developed but unsophisticated services. Maximizing the use is where countries are providing quality services to individuals within a digital service environment. And fourthly, creating a conceptual framework for developing online services, including theoretical frameworks. Okay, there is a difference between technology policy and operationalization. I think there's a lot of rhetoric around the potential of technology, but actually getting it operationalized is a different order of magnitude. So looking at the increasing use of technology, where it refers to products, infrastructure, and electronic content that enhances policy and systems development and delivery of guidance services, resources, and tools. And it's clear that there's a need for creative and innovative thinking on how technology can help to deliver coordinated, flexible, and personalized services. And we need to start exploiting the potential of artificial intelligence and machine learning. So we have countries where ICT tools are mainly restricted to delivering information, where secondly, communication tools are used, but that's pretty much it. There are also countries where collaborative spaces are used as a way to facilitate interactive communication and information sharing. And then finally, where the impetus for transformation in career guidance delivery is beginning to be kind of realized. Okay, so if we move on to professionalization, which is so crucial to our profession, as is the professional identity of all members of our profession, which is typically, gained through continuing professional development. Professionalism and qualifications are one notable quality criteria for national guidance systems, and determining quality is very problematic. Professional bodies, both at national and international level, have a very key role retaining cutting-edge practice is a challenge, I think, in current delivery environments, where practitioners are increasingly under pressure to achieve more for less. And when we look at the state of professionalisation across the EU, it's not a particularly encouraging picture, with some countries where there is resistance to the idea of professionalisation, some countries where they are aspirational, they want it to happen, but there's no enforcement mechanisms that exist. Thirdly, where it is evident on a partial basis, where our field is trying hard to implement standards, but lacks legislation. And then fourthly, some form of legislative requirement has been established specifying minimum levels of training in CPD, which is regrettably quite rare. So the final feature is evidence and impact of lifelong learning, and we've heard a lot, haven't we, recently about evaluating impact. We all know it's needed. We also know that different stakeholders are interested in different outcomes. From the evidence, it is the case that feedback loops can help improve services, but there is an urgent need, and there has been for some time, for new ways to think about and evidence the outcomes of guidance provision. And there is, I think, an increasing agreement, at least in the field, if not with policymakers, that hard measures don't reflect the diversity of how citizens progress into and through the labour market, and that we have a real need for soft measures, but considerable tensions exist on that particular score. So where it's desired, we have an acknowledged need, but nothing really happening. Ad hoc feedback occurs in many countries, collected by a range of mechanisms. Thirdly, annual thematic data collection occurs, but there's no overall strategy for doing anything with the results. And then fourthly, a range of qualitative and quantitative data are systematically collected, feeding into service delivery and improvements. Okay, so I think I'm going to go fairly quickly over the next few slides, but one of the other things that the European Union asked us to do was to map the ecosystems of lifelong guidance. And what we decided to do was represent it at the level of the individual in the centre there, at the national level and at the EU level. And you can see from the initial picture how complex it became. This took the researchers, the group of researchers, some considerable time to formulate. So if we just quickly go through the next, so at the level of the individual, the education ecosystem, we tried to typify, and then the next slide looks at the individual in relation to the labour market ecosystem. And the next one is then building up to the EU level. And then fourthly, the national level. I'm sure we missed some things out, but we did actually come up with a map of the ecosystems that the European Union was very satisfied with. So changes to the ecosystem, there is a trend towards more integrated lifelong services. There's an emphasis on its central importance and tailoring a provision. This is all, I think, very crucial. New and innovative guidance practice and tools are emerging, plus new modes of delivery. Technology is enabling greater cooperation, service provision, production and exchange of information. There's greater coherence and coordination in some countries, and the responsibilities of actors involved in delivery has expanded and changed. So I think these are all extremely significant and encouraging features of our field. Innovations in lifelong guidance practices were found in a number of countries, and there is what we called a catalogue of innovatory practices in the EU, which I think is worth looking at if you are interested in the notion of innovation. But there are some significant types that have been identified in relation to a number of different aspects of our service, and it's, I think, well worth flicking through that. Okay, if we can just then go on to the conclusions. Deep breath after all of that information, the sorts of conclusions that emerged from the data are itemised, and I will just quickly go through them. At an EU level, lifelong guidance is the shared policy responsibility. Strong strategic leadership in lifelong guidance policy development with stakeholder involvement helps to address policy fragmentation. Thirdly, citizen entitlement to guidance are being used as policy levers to facilitate continuity of services across contexts. Where lifelong guidance policies don't have a statutory underpinning, it is very difficult for them to be connected to other national strategies. And there is potential, but there is potential to foster national mutual learning and networking systems. And then the second lot of conclusions was that the delivery of guidance systems is too often fragmented, but technology is helping to create more seamless delivery. Publicly funded lifelong guidance services can be vulnerable to funding changes with changes in elected members. Innovative practice relating to the empowerment of citizens to develop career adaptability and career management skills are evident. They have been noted. Labour market information is increasingly important in guidance systems. There is, however, little evidence of member states providing long-term investment in technical infrastructure and workforce development. Professional associations have a very important role in raising and maintaining the professionalisation of our workforce. And last but not least, monitoring of the inputs and outcomes of guidance need to be monitored